Susan Bremer reread the code for the third time, trying to find the error. The monitor cast a bluish light on her pale face, and her fingers fluttered habitually over the keyboard. There was almost no one left in the open space. The workday was coming to an end, and most of the employees had gone home. The phone vibrated quietly. A message from Paul. "Meet me at 19000 at the Anderson Grill." Susan smiled. It was their favorite restaurant, the place of their first date. She glanced quickly at her watch. There was just over an hour left, just enough time to finish with the code and get cleaned up. Anderson's Grill was located in the historic downtown area, in an old red brick building. The vintage lanterns were lit in the evening, giving the place a special charm. Paul was already waiting for her at their favorite table by the window. He looked unaccustomedly serious and a little nervous. Susan noticed him adjusting his tie every now and then. "You look very pretty tonight," he said, when the waiter brought the menu. Susan was wearing a simple black dress. She hadn't had time to stop home to change after work. "Thank you," she replied, feeling her cheeks begin to burn. Something special was in the air today. They talked about work, Paul talking about a new construction project, Susan complaining about another bug in the program. But the conversation was interrupted every now and then by awkward pauses. After dessert, Paul suddenly became very serious. "Susan," he began, and his voice trembled slightly. "We've known each other for over a year now. It's been the happiest year of my life." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, and Susan's breath caught. A white gold ring with a small diamond sparkled in the light of the restaurant lamps. "Will you marry me?" Susan couldn't speak. She simply nodded, feeling tears of joy flow down her cheeks. Paul slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. The waiter brought the champagne. Paul had planned everything in advance. Susan's hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone to call her mother. "Mom! Paul proposed!" she blurted out as soon as Lynette picked up the phone. "Oh, honey, I'm so excited! Come home soon. I'll make something special." When they arrived, the table was already set, and the aroma of her signature roast was wafting from the oven. She hugged her daughter, kissed her, and then turned to Paul. Her gaze lingered on him a little longer than usual, as if she were really looking at him for the first time. Tall, trim, with correct facial features and attentive brown eyes. Now this wasn't just her daughter's boyfriend. This was her future son-in-law. "Welcome to the family," she said as she hugged him. For a moment, Paul thought the hug lasted a little longer than it should have, but he pushed the thought away. The evening was filled with joy, plans for the future, and dreams of their upcoming wedding. Susan couldn't stop admiring the ring. It looked perfect on her hand, as if it had always been there. She was so happy that she didn't notice the change in her mother's gaze when she looked at Paul. Nor did she notice Paul's hand on Lynette's waist for a split second as he said goodbye before leaving. Outside the window, the sunset was fading, coloring the sky in shades of pink and gold. A new chapter in their lives was beginning, and neither of them could have guessed where it would take them. The Ocean View Shopping Center was unusually quiet for a weekday, as Lynette Bremer sat at her desk in the administrative office, poring over rental paperwork. Her work was not going well. Her thoughts kept returning to her daughter's upcoming wedding. She had an open wedding magazine in front of her, and she furtively glanced at the glossy pages when no one was looking. 23 years had flown by like a blink of an eye. It seemed like only yesterday she was holding tiny Susan in her arms, and today her girl was getting married. Lynette sighed, looking at the picture of the next wedding cake. She had devoted herself to her daughter after her divorce, and now she had to learn to live her life differently. The phone on the table rang, snapping her out of her reverie. It was Susan she wanted to meet tonight to discuss the guest list. Lynette quickly agreed, feeling a pang of guilt for spending her work hours flipping through magazines. After work, she stopped by the supermarket. The cart was quickly filling up with groceries. Lynette loved to cook, especially when her daughter came to visit. She was just contemplating what wine to buy for dinner when she heard a familiar voice. "Mrs. Bremer? Let me help you." Paul appeared as if out of nowhere, tall and smiling. He was wearing a smart suit. Apparently he was coming home from work, too. Without waiting for an answer, he took the heavy bags from her. "Paul, don't, and call me Lynette, please." She looked embarrassed, fixing a disheveled strand of hair. In her 42, she still attracted the attention of men, but now for some reason it made her slightly uneasy. They walked to her house together. Susan would be arriving later. She was late for work. Paul carried the bags into the kitchen, and Lynette offered him coffee. He agreed, and the two of them found themselves alone in the cozy kitchen, flooded with evening light. Lynette reached for the cups on the top shelf. Paul instinctively stepped closer to help, and for a moment they were too close to each other. His hand accidentally touched her waist, and they both froze. The second stretched into an eternity. Then Lynette took a step back, laughing awkwardly. "Sorry, I'm so clumsy," she muttered, turning away from the coffee machine. Paul said something back, but she couldn't hear. Her ears were buzzing with blood. They talked about the wedding, about work, about the weather, about everything and nothing, carefully avoiding looking each other in the eye. When Susan arrived, they were already sitting at a table a safe distance apart, discussing the guest list. She kissed both of them and pulled out her laptop. "So, I've made a tentative list of 50 people." The evening flowed on. They debated whether to invite distant relatives, discussed the menu and music. Lynette watched her daughter and her fiancé, the way they looked at each other, the way Susan flung back her hair in the same gesture she'd done as a child, the way Paul gently took her hand. They were a beautiful couple. Susan had inherited her mother's dark hair and green eyes, but she was like her father in personality, just as determined and rational. Paul complimented her with his calmness and thoroughness. When they finally finished the list, it was late. Paul volunteered to walk Susan to the car. Lynette was alone in the kitchen, listening to their distant footsteps and voices. She mechanically gathered the dishes, trying not to think about the moment when she and Paul had stood so close. It was a common awkwardness between future in-laws, nothing more. She loved her daughter and wanted only happiness for her. But then why did her hands shake slightly as she stacked the cups in the dishwasher? Why did she still feel the warmth of his casual touch? Lynette resolutely closed the dishwasher and turned it on. The sound of the water drowned out the unwelcome thoughts. She pulled another wedding magazine from the closet and sat down at the table, forcing herself to focus on choosing flowers for the bride's bouquet. There was a lot to do ahead, and she couldn't afford to be distracted by strange thoughts. After all, it was just an accident, one of those awkward moments that happen in life and are immediately forgotten. Outside the window, dusk was thickening, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would be a new day, full of worries and preparations for the wedding. Life went on as it should, and everything was exactly as it should be. At least that was what Lynette wanted to believe. The day was unusually chilly for mid-spring. Lynette ran into the Starbucks on Main Street to escape the sudden rain. She didn't like chain coffee shops, preferring small, family-run establishments, but she had no choice. It was still a 15-minute walk to the mall, and she'd left her umbrella at the office. The line moved slowly. Lynette was absent-mindedly looking at the menu when she heard a familiar voice. Paul was standing at the register, ordering his coffee. She instinctively took a step back, as if she wanted to hide, but it was too late. He had already spotted her and waved hello. "Lynette, what a meeting! Escaping the rain, too?" His smile was warm and genuine. He was wearing a dark blue suit that went especially well with his brown eyes. The perfect son-in-law from a good family. Exactly the kind of husband she'd always wanted for her daughter. "Yeah, I forgot my umbrella at work." She didn't finish. It was her turn to order. Paul suddenly stepped forward. "Let me buy you a coffee, and maybe you'd like to keep me company? I'm just on my lunch break." She should have said no. She should have made up some reason, said she was busy. But instead, she heard her own voice say, "Thank you, I'd love to." They were seated at a table at the back of the room. Paul talked about the new construction project, about how difficult it was to coordinate the documentation, about his plans for the future. Lynette listened, watching the way he gestured, the way he pushed his bangs back from his forehead. Just like Susan, they were even similar in those little habits. "And how did you meet Susan?" she asked, taking a sip of her latte. Paul smiled, but strangely, as if through force. At a corporate event. Mutual friends introduced me." He fell silent, eyeing his cup. "You know, Lynette, can I ask you a personal question?" She nodded, feeling her pulse quicken. "Were you happily married? Before the divorce?" The question caught her off guard. She'd never discussed her personal life with her daughter's fiancé. "No," she answered after a pause. "I think we both knew it was a mistake. It's just that I got pregnant and we decided to get married." "And then?" His eyes scrutinized her face. "Then he left for another woman when Susan was 5, and I just lived for my daughter." She didn't understand why she was telling him all this, why she was letting the conversation get so personal. "You're an amazing woman, Lynette." His hand suddenly covered her palm, resting on the table. The touch burned like an electric shock. "Paul," she began, but he'd already pulled his hand away as if nothing had happened. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows of the coffee shop. They talked about nothing, avoiding looking at each other. When it was time to leave, Paul offered her a ride to work. "You don't have an umbrella," he reminded her. The car was warm and smelled of leather seats. They were silent, listening to the sound of rain and windshield wipers. In the mall parking lot, Paul turned off the engine. "Thanks for the company," he said quietly. Lynette turned to answer and suddenly realized their faces were too close. It happened on its own. They reached for each other at the same time. The kiss was brief, almost chaste, but it was as if the ground had gone out from under their feet. Lynette pulled back first, gasping. "No, we can't. Susan." "I'm sorry," Paul said hoarsely. "I shouldn't have." She jumped out of the car into the rain without listening to his words. She ran to the entrance of the mall, not feeling soaked through. In the restroom, she took a long look at her reflection in the mirror. Her lips were still burning from the kiss. "It doesn't mean anything," she told herself. "It was a mistake, and it won't happen again." The phone jingled with a message from Susan. "Mom, I'm going to be late tonight. I have an important project due. Don't expect me for dinner." Lynette stared at the screen and wanted to scream. Her girl, her favorite daughter, trusts her, loves her, and she... The rest of the day passed like a blur. She mechanically did her work, checked documents, talked to tenants, and before her eyes stood the attentive gaze of brown eyes, and the phantom sensation of someone else's lips did not let go. In the evening, she sat in the kitchen for a long time in total darkness. It was still raining outside the window. Somewhere in the city, her daughter was working on an important project, unaware that her mother, her only truly close person, had betrayed her trust. "It won't happen again," she told the darkness again. But somewhere in the back of her mind, she already knew she was lying to herself, and that knowledge made it scary. The Blue Moon Motel hid between the hills 20 minutes out of town. The sign had long since faded, and the M in the name had burned out, but the inside was clean and neat. Lynette parked the car farther away from the registration office. Her hands shook as she pulled the key from the ignition. Room 15 was at the very end of a long row of one-story houses. Lynette paused in front of the door, looking at the peeling paint. Somewhere in the distance, an airplane flew by, leaving a white trail in the blue spring sky. She could leave right now. She could have called Paul and told him she'd changed her mind, that it was a mistake, that... The door opened. He was already waiting for her. "I thought you weren't coming," Paul said quietly. He was in jeans and a light-colored shirt, not at all like his usual businesslike and collected self. Lynette stepped inside, and the door closed behind her with a quiet click. The room was standard. A bed, a nightstand, and a small television on the wall. An orange silk scarf hung from the bedside lamp, creating a warm, intimate illumination. Lynette felt nauseous. What was she doing here? What was she thinking when she agreed to this meeting? "We shouldn't," she began. But Paul had already pulled her to him. His lips were demanding, insistent. She wanted to push him away, but instead her hands slid under his shirt on their own, feeling the warmth of his skin. Then there was much silence, interrupted only by their breathing and the rustle of the sheets. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, streaking the room in streaks of light and shadow. Somewhere behind the wall, the television was on. the muffled voices of a daytime talk show. Reality came crashing down on her when it was over. Lynette lay staring at the ceiling, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. Paul tried to put his arms around her, but she pulled away. "I love you," he said suddenly. "From the day I saw you. I know it's wrong, but I can't help it." Lynette covered her face with her hands. Please don't say that. It's true." He gently pulled her hands away from her face. "I've never felt like this before, not even with—" He didn't finish, but his daughter's name hung between them like a sentence. Lynette sat up abruptly on the bed, pulling on her clothes with shaking hands. "I have to go. I have an appointment with Susan. She wants to show off the wedding dress." Paul caught her arm. "Stay a little longer." There was such tenderness in his voice that her eyes pinched again. "No," she shook her head. "We can't. It was the first and last time." He didn't hold her back. Silently, he watched her fix her makeup, tidy her hair. Only when she had already grabbed the doorknob did he say quietly, "I'll wait for you here, next Friday, same time." She didn't answer. She jumped out of the room and almost ran to the car. Her hands were shaking so badly that she couldn't immediately put the key in the ignition. It took Lynette 15 minutes to get to the bridal salon, even though it usually took half an hour. Susan was already waiting for her, glowing with anticipation. "Mom, you're late! I was already thinking of starting without you!" The dress was beautiful, classic with a lace top and bouffant skirt. Susan twirled around in front of the mirror, happy and beautiful, like a princess from a fairy tale. "Do you think Paul would like it?" Lynette swallowed the lump in her throat. "He'll love it, honey." She hugged her daughter, feeling her snuggle up to her, so trusting, so dear. "You're the most beautiful bride in the world." "Mom, are you crying?" Susan looked at her in surprise. "All moms cry when they see their daughters in their wedding dress." Lynette tried to smile. "I'm just really happy for you." That evening alone, she stood under the shower for a long time, as if trying to wash away the day's events. The smell of someone else's cologne, the touch of someone else's hands, the taste of kisses. But the hot water couldn't wash away the guilt and the strange, agonizing anticipation of next Friday. The clock ticked in the bedroom, counting down the minutes until dawn. The trees rustled outside the window, and a dog barked in the distance. Lynette lay awake, staring into the darkness. She knew she had to stop, knew she had no right to do this to her daughter. And she knew that next Friday, she would drive back to the Blue Moon Motel where Paul would be waiting for her. The phone on the nightstand blinked silently. A message had come in. "I can't stop thinking about you," Paul wrote. Lynette didn't reply, but she didn't delete the message either. She lay in the dark, feeling her heart racing, and realized she was missing. 5. Diagnosis. The waiting room of the city clinic smelled of antiseptic and old magazines. Lynette sat on a plastic chair, examining her hands. On the ring finger of her left one was the white mark of a wedding ring she'd taken off years ago. The nurse behind the front desk was typing something monotonously on the computer. "Mrs. Bremer?" A young doctor in a white coat held an envelope with the results. "Come with me." Lynette stood up, feeling a strange weakness in her knees. She was taking routine tests, a routine physical for her job at the mall. Why would the doctor want to talk in person? The office was small and impersonal. A desk, 2 chairs, a couch against the wall. On the desk was an old computer with a yellowish monitor. The doctor sat down at the desk and opened the envelope. His face was serious. "Please sit down." He was silent, as if choosing his words. "I don't have the most pleasant news. The human immunodeficiency virus has been detected in your tests. I'm very sorry." The words came out as if through absorbent cotton. Lynette stared at the doctor, not understanding what he was saying. HIV? She had it? There must be some mistake. There had to be a mistake. "No, you're confusing something," she laughed nervously. "I can't be. I'm not." She fell silent, remembering the last few months. Paul, only Paul. No one else. "Unfortunately, there's no mistake." The doctor said something about confirmatory tests, about modern treatments, about it not being a verdict. Lynette wasn't listening. One thought was bouncing around in her head. She must warn Paul. You need to contact all your partners from the last 6 months. The doctor's voice broke through the fog in her head. They need to get tested, and of course no unprotected contact. Leaving the clinic, Lynette got into her car and pulled out her cell phone. Her fingers trembled as she typed a message. "We need to talk urgently. It's important." The reply came almost immediately. In an hour at the park by the fountain. She arrived early. She wandered along the paths strewn with young leaves, looking at the children playing, at the couples on the benches. Just an ordinary spring day. Everything was as it always was, but nothing would ever be the same again. Paul showed up exactly 1 hour later. He smiled when he saw her, but the smile faded when he noticed the look on her face. "What's wrong?" They sat down on a bench on the far side of the park where there were fewer people. Lynette pulled the test results out of her bag. "I was at the clinic today." She couldn't bring herself to say it out loud, just held the papers out to him. Paul read silently. She saw the white of his fingers clutching the sheet, the way the paint peeled off his face. "It can't be," he finally said. "I've never... only with you and with..." He didn't finish. Susan, their girl, the engagement, the wedding, the plans for the future. It was all crumbling like a house of cards. "You need to take a test," Lynette said quietly. Paul nodded, still staring at the papers with an unseeing gaze. "I'll go right now." They parted without looking at each other. Lynette sat on the bench for a long time, watching the sun go down. There was water splashing in the fountain, music playing somewhere, people laughing. Just an ordinary spring evening in a city park. The phone rang late at night. "Test positive." Paul's voice sounded muffled, lifeless. "What should we do?" What should they do? Lynette didn't know the answer. She sat in the kitchen in complete darkness, clutching the phone in her hands. Somewhere in the next room, Susan, who had returned late from work, was asleep. Her girl, who was due to marry the man of her dreams in 2 months. "We have to cancel everything," she finally said. "The wedding, all the plans. We can't..." "I love you," Paul said suddenly. "No matter what happens, I love you." There was such hopelessness in his voice that her throat caught. "Don't," she whispered. "Please don't." But he'd already hung up. Lynette sat in the kitchen until dawn, watched the sky graying outside the window, the city waking up. Somewhere in the bedroom, Susan's alarm clock rang. A new day was beginning, and somehow she had to get on with her life. But how? A glossy wedding magazine lay on the table. A happy bride in a white dress smiled from the cover. Lynette stared at the picture and she wanted to scream, but she couldn't even allow herself to do that. She needed to smile, to plan the wedding, to be the happy mother of the bride. And inside, everything was dying with fear and guilt. "Mom, are you up already?" Susan appeared in the kitchen, sleepy and worried. "Why are you sitting up in the dark?" "Just thinking about the wedding." Lynette turned on the light and smiled. "Would you like some coffee?" And life flowed on as if nothing had happened. Only now every morning began with a handful of pills, and every glance in the mirror resonated with pain and shame. The Bremer house was always quiet in the mornings. Susan loved that silence. She could drink coffee, look through the mail, and get ready for work without rushing. Her mother usually left early, leaving a note on the kitchen table with some sweet wishes. This morning it was business as usual. On the table was a note. "Honey, don't forget to pick up the invitations from the printer. Kisses, Mom." Next to it was a cup of coffee. Lynette was obviously in a hurry. Susan poured herself a fresh pot of coffee and reached for her phone. 2 identical iPhones in black cases lay side by side on the table. She and her mother had bought them on the same day. The salesman had even joked that they were like twins. Susan automatically picked up the nearest one, unlocked it with her fingerprint. She and her mother had the same fingerprint set up on both phones, just in case. The screen came to life, and immediately a message popped up. From Paul. "I miss you. Yesterday was amazing." Susan blinked, reread the message. There was a strange feeling of emptiness in her stomach. It could have just been an unfortunate compliment to her future mother-in-law, or a joke, or... Her finger slid across the screen, opening the correspondence. The first messages were ordinary, wedding discussions, some mundane trivia. But the further she leafed through, the colder she felt inside. Expecting you on Friday, number 15. I can't stop thinking about your hands. You're driving me crazy. Photographs, intimate, personal, her mother and her fiancé, together. Susan couldn't tear her gaze away even though nausea was coming up her throat. Blue Moon Motel, every Friday, for months now. And then there were the medical reports, diagnoses, HIV. Oh my God, they're HIV positive, both of them. And they were planning a wedding in 2 months. Susan, her mother's voice sounded like a thunderclap. Lynette stood in the kitchen doorway, and you could see it in her face. She understood. Honey, I can explain. Explain? Susan didn't recognize her voice. Hoarse, foreign. What exactly do you want to explain, Mom? How you're sleeping with my fiancé, or how you were going to keep silent about HIV? The phone slipped from her hands, falling to the floor with a thud. Lynette stepped forward, trying to hug her daughter, but Susan recoiled like a leper. Don't touch me, never. Don't you dare touch me again. She ran out of the kitchen, stumbling like a drunk. Her ears were buzzing, her eyes were blurry. She grabbed her bag, her car keys. Lynette shouted something after her, but the words didn't reach her consciousness. Only when she was in the car did Susan let herself scream. She screamed and beat her hands on the steering wheel until she was hoarse. Then came the daze. She sat in the car, parked somewhere on the outskirts of town, and stared straight ahead. The phone was ringing off the hook. Her mother, Paul, friends, co-workers. She turned it off. The pictures from the phone stood in front of her eyes. Her mother, always so proper, so caring. Her fiancé, who swore his love, said she was the one. They had betrayed her, both of them, the people closest to her. There was a stack of wedding invitations in the glove compartment. She'd just picked them up from the printer yesterday. Beautiful, on expensive paper, embossed and calligraphed. It is our pleasure to invite you to the wedding. Susan tore open one invitation, then another, and the next. When it got dark, she finally turned on the phone. 37 missed calls from her mother, 23 from Paul. She didn't even bother to read the messages. She just deleted them all. She'd gone to a friend's house for the night. She lied about fixing the bathroom, about a burst pipe. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her head was filled with scraps of messages, pictures, medical reports. In the morning, she drove to Paul's office. They had to talk. He had to explain. He had to explain something. There was a stationery knife in her bag. She always carried it with her for working on layouts. Susan didn't think about the knife. She didn't think about anything at all. She just drove, mechanically shifting gears, stopping at stoplights. The day promised to be sunny. The first tulips were blooming in the park across from Paul's office. Somewhere a bird was chirping. The reception area of the architecture office was empty. The receptionist had gone out for lunch. Susan knew the office routine by heart, just as she knew the code to Paul's office door. 3791. The day they met. The day he supposedly thought was special. Paul was standing at the window talking on the phone. When he heard the sound of the door opening, he turned around and faltered half-heartedly. "I'll call you back," he said into the receiver, keeping his eyes on Susan. "Talk to who? Mom?" Her voice sounded calm, too calm. Discussed how to make my life more comfortable, or just making arrangements for the next meeting at the motel. Paul slowly placed the phone on the table. "You know." It wasn't a question. "Yes, I know." Susan sat down in the visitor's chair, carefully straightening her skirt. "Know everything about your affair, about the diagnosis, about how you were going to keep quiet and let me get married without knowing anything." On the wall hung a portrait of them together, an engagement gift from co-workers. The happy couple smiling into the lens. What a lie. What a monstrous lie. "I was going to cancel." Paul ran a hand over his face. He looked haggard, drained. "After I found out about HIV, I couldn't do that to you." "How noble," Susan smiled, and that smile made Paul involuntarily take a step back. "So you could fuck my mother then? Send her pictures of yourself, could you? Swearing your love to her. Could you do that too?" "Susan." He made a move toward her, but she put her hand out, stopping him. "Don't come any closer. Just answer. Why? What was all this for? Why did you have to propose if you— I thought I could love you, Paul said quietly. You were perfect. Smart, beautiful, successful. I was supposed to fall in love with you. Everyone said what a beautiful couple we were. He fell silent, looking out the window. Outside the glass was the city park where they had once walked, making plans for the future. And then I met your mother, and I realized I'd never experienced anything like it in my life. Go on, Susan said. Her hands rested in her lap, as still as a porcelain doll's. Tell me everything. I want to know. Lynette, she's special. There's some mystery about her, some depth. I've tried to fight that feeling, really tried. But every time I saw her— He talked and talked, not noticing how each word hit Susan flat on the face. Your mother is the only woman I've ever truly loved, he finally said. I'm sorry. I know it sounds awful, but it's true. Silence hung in the office. You could hear someone talking in the hallway, the air conditioner humming, cars honking outside the window, the usual sounds of a normal workday. You know what the worst part is? Susan stood up, pulling her skirt down. I loved you both, didn't I? I loved you both more than anyone in the world. My mom, she's been all about me all my life since my dad left. And you, I thought you were the one. She went to the wall and took down the portrait of them together, slid her finger across the glass. It's funny, isn't it? I thought I'd finally have a real family. Turns out, the picture flew into the wall. The glass shattered with a deafening clang. Susan! Paul rushed toward her, but she was already at the door. Don't touch me. Don't ever touch me again. She walked out of the office, carefully closing the door behind her. The receptionist was already back in the waiting room. She raised her eyebrows in surprise when she heard the clinking of glass. Is everything all right? Yeah, just a little family squabble. Family, what a funny word, what a scary word. Susan walked down the street, unable to make out the road. Something jingled in her bag, a clerical knife hitting her keys. She didn't even look in that direction. There was an emptiness inside, a huge, bottomless void that needed filling. Tomorrow, she thought. I'll come back here tomorrow, and we'll finish this conversation. For now, she just walked down the street, watching the sun go down. Somewhere in the city, her mother was cooking dinner in an empty house. Somewhere in the office, Paul was picking up the shards of a broken photograph, and she walked and walked, feeling something dark and scary growing inside, something that had yet to take shape. The office was slowly sinking into twilight. Paul sat at his desk, staring at the monitor, but not seeing what was being displayed. All day he had been trying to call Lynette, but she hadn't answered. Susan wasn't picking up either. There was still a picture of them together on the table, the same one Susan had ripped off the wall yesterday. It was crumpled, without glass, with a bent corner. He straightened it out, gazing at the smiling faces. What a happy time it had been, and how it had all come crashing down. A soft knock on the door made him wince. Susan stood on the threshold, pale, calm, wearing a strict gray suit. May I come in? Her voice sounded almost indifferent. I thought we should talk calmly, without last night's tantrums. She walked to the window and paused, looking out at the evening city. The silence dragged on. You know, she finally said without turning around, I was up all night, thinking about what you said, about you and Mom, about how I was a mistake. Susan, no, let me finish. She turned to him, and something strange was in her face, like a mask with nothing behind it. I realized I can't hate you. Not you, not her. You didn't do it on purpose, did you? It just happened. Paul looked at her confused. This was something he hadn't expected. I want us to part as friends. Susan smiled some strange, inanimate smile. Why don't we just hug goodbye and forget all this? She stepped toward him, opening her arms. In the twilight, her face seemed very young, almost childlike. Paul got up from the table, stepped toward her. I'm sorry, she whispered, snuggling against him. Her hand slid to her bag, fumbled for the handle of a clerical knife. In one swift, almost imperceptible movement, the blade sliced through the skin on his neck. Clearly, precisely, as she'd done hundreds of times with layouts at work. Paul jerked, trying to pull away. But it was too late. Blood rushed in a warm stream, flooding his shirt, her hands, the floor. He opened his mouth, but only a wheeze came out instead of a scream. For a few seconds he still stood there, holding his throat. Then his knees buckled. Susan took a step back, watching him sink to the floor. Her face was still as calm, almost serene. She carefully placed the knife in her bag, pulled out wet wipes, wiped her hands. Dark stains blurred on the gray suit. When Paul stopped wheezing, she walked to the restroom at the far end of the hallway. The office was empty and quiet. Only the air conditioners hummed. Cold water ran down her hands for a long time until it washed away all traces. She rinsed the knife thoroughly under the stream, being careful not to leave a single streak on the metal. The stains on the suit took a long time to wash out. She remembered from some articles that hot water would only set the blood in the fabric. Cold water and soap gradually did the trick, leaving only barely visible streaks, like coffee stains. Paper towels blotted the wet spots on her jacket and skirt. She carefully collected the used towels in a bag, which she would throw away on the way home in another neighborhood. There was no one in the hallway. Everyone had long since gone home. She quietly went down the stairs, went out the emergency exit. She stopped at the trash cans, pulled out a knife wrapped in napkins, threw it in the container. It was only in the car that she finally blinked, as if waking up. The hands that held the steering wheel were clean. She had wiped them thoroughly, but she still felt like they were covered in blood. She turned on the engine and drove slowly out of the parking lot. The body wasn't found until the morning. The cleaning lady who opened the office at 7 in the morning didn't even immediately realize that the dark puddle on the floor was blood. When she did, she screamed so loud the whole floor came running. Detectives Lyfair and Hodge arrived 20 minutes after the call. Catherine Lyfair, a tall woman with a short haircut, went straight to the body while her partner interviewed the first witnesses. One precise blow, the medical examiner stated. Carotid artery severed. Death was quick, between 19 and 20 o'clock last night. The dead man's cell phone rang on the desk. Lynette! It popped up on the screen. The detectives looked at each other. The day was just beginning. In a dumpster outside the office building, detectives found a package, a few wet wipes soaked in blood, and a wrapped box cutter. The blade had been thoroughly washed. No prints or traces of blood. But on the napkins, experts immediately identified the victim's blood. The killer was neat, Catherine Lyfair remarked as she watched the forensics team bag the evidence. The knife is washed, but the tissues aren't scattered in different containers. It's like he wanted us to find it. A clerical knife, Hodge grumbled, looking at the evidence in the bag. There's one of those lying around on every other desk. What are we going to do with it? Interview family and friends for starters. Lyfair turned to the young officer. Johnson, check the cameras. We're interested in any that go out to the dumpsters in the last 24 hours. If there are any at all, of course. They arrived at Susan Bremer's house toward evening. The door was opened by a pale young woman in a black dress. She looked at the detectives calmly, without a trace of recent tears. Miss Bremer, I'm Detective Lyfair. This is Detective Hodge. We're investigating the murder of your fiancé. May we come in? Susan led them into the living room, a bright room with many photographs on the walls. Wedding magazines lay on the coffee table. One was open to a page of cakes. Would you like coffee? She asked so mundanely, as if old friends had stopped by. I have cookies. Thank you, Catherine replied softly. Miss Bremer, we understand how difficult this is for you, but we need to ask you a few questions. Has Paul talked about any problems lately? Maybe someone has been threatening him? Susan poured the coffee into cups. Her hands were steady. She hadn't spilled a drop. You know, she said thoughtfully, I was just thinking about that, about Paul's enemies. She was silent for a moment. There was one person who really hated him. Who? Said Hodge, pulling out a notebook. Me, Susan answered simply. I hated him, and last night I went to his office and hugged him and slit his throat. That's what you're here for, isn't it? The detectives looked at each other. Catherine leaned forward cautiously. Susan, do you realize what you're saying? Of course, she sipped her coffee. Would you like me to tell you from the beginning? How I found their correspondence on my mother's cell phone? How did I find out about their affair? about HIV, about how they were going to keep quiet until they were married. She talked for over an hour, calmly, methodically describing every detail, how she'd gotten to the office, how she'd pulled out the knife, how she'd hugged Paul one last time, how she'd washed her hands with cold water, how she'd scrubbed the stains from her suit. "I felt nothing," she said at the end. "No anger, no fear, just doing what I had to do." At the police station, she was questioned again, officially. She repeated everything word for word, without changing a single detail. The lawyer called by Lynette tried to silence her, but Susan only shook her head. "I want to tell the truth. The psychiatric evaluation lasted several weeks. Doctors determined a classic case of affect, emotional distress from the double betrayal, exacerbated by the HIV information. At the trial, the prosecutor demanded the maximum sentence, but the defense presented irrefutable evidence. The results of tests of Paul and Lynette, their correspondence, the conclusion of psychiatrists, the double betrayal from the closest people, the threat to health, the state of affect, all this mitigated the sentence. Lynette tried to talk to her daughter in the courtroom. "Susan, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I love you." But Susan looked through her as if she couldn't hear. "Defendant, do you have anything you want to say in your last word?" Susan stood up. In her black, austere suit, she seemed older than her 23 years. "I don't regret what I did," she said calmly. "I was protecting myself, not from a physical threat, but from the betrayal of those I trusted most. They killed something important in me, and I killed back. It's only fair." 8 years with parole eligibility in 5, the judge read out. Susan nodded. She was led away from the courtroom in handcuffs. Lynette made a move toward her daughter, but the guard blocked her path. She was left standing in the middle of the empty courtroom, clutching her bag. The case was closed. The prison greeted visitors with gray walls and the smell of bleach. Every last Thursday of the month, Lynette walked the same path. Metal detector, Idaho check, long hallway to the visiting room. "Bremer Susan," she said to the guard. The guard would check the list and shake his head each time. "She refuses to meet." For the first 6 months, Lynette cried, begging her daughter to give her letters, photos, some little things from home. Then she stopped. She just came, called her name, was refused, and drove back. She sold the house. Too many memories. She rented a small apartment near the prison, quit her job at the mall, couldn't stand the sympathetic looks, got a job in a small store on the outskirts of town where no one knew her story. For the 3rd year, she arrived as usual on the last Thursday of the month. August was hot, the asphalt melting underfoot. A fan hummed in the waiting room. "Bremer Susan," she said familiarly to the new guard. He flipped through the log. "Released 2 weeks ago on amnesty. Sign right here that you received the information." Lynette stared at the outstretched pen, not understanding. "What do you mean, released? Why wasn't I informed?" "Not supposed to." The guard shrugged. "She's an adult. She's in charge of her own information. Sign right here." "And where did she go? Is there an address of some sort?" "Not supposed to," the guard said again. "Sign here and clear the line." Lynette walked out into the hot parking lot, got into her car. In the glove compartment was a stack of unsent letters she'd brought one every month. They were useless now. Somewhere in this huge city, or maybe not even in this city anymore, was her daughter. Free, alive, alien. Lynette started the car. In the rearview mirror, she saw the gray walls of the prison, the last place she knew exactly where her daughter was. Ahead lay the empty road, melting from the heat. She would not come here again on the last Thursday of the month. Won't give her daughter's name to the guard. Wouldn't wait for rejection. The car moved out of the driveway. At the corner, Lynette took one last look at the prison in the rearview mirror. The building dissolved into the heat of the day, growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared.